Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow, and in the early hours of Wednesday the 2nd of November, these are our main stories. After days of silence, Brazil's President Bolsonaro says he will respect the constitution, but did not admit defeat to the former left-wing leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Is the former Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, on the brink of a comeback following the fifth election in less than 4 years? And
we have several states here where the courts can discriminate against parents on the basis of disability alone in custody cases.
A quadriplegic mother of twins on a mission to change US law. Also in this podcast, the new Twitter owner Elon Musk suggests the site will charge $8 a month to verify users' accounts. Oh, and get ready to rave. Unless you're in Italy. No raving there. Brazilians waited 2 days to hear from President Jair Bolsonaro after his election defeat on Sunday. 48 hours of uncertainty when it was unclear whether the leader might try to cling to power in spite of the vote. But just a few hours before recording, Mr. Bolsonaro finally did make a public statement. He didn't admit defeat, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he appeared to address those of his supporters who, since Sunday, have erected blockades on more than 200 major roads around Brazil in protest.
This popular movement is the result of indignation and a sense of injustice about how the electoral process was carried out. Peaceful demonstrations will always be welcome, but our methods cannot be those of the left, which have always damaged the interests of the people. This includes the invasion of property and essentially the right to move freely.
On Tuesday, the Supreme Court labelled the roadblocks an attack on democracy and ordered that they be cleared. Police fired tear gas at demonstrators in an effort to move them on. The newsroom's Nick Miles is in Rio de Janeiro. I asked him what signal President Bolsonaro's comments sent to his supporters.
As he left the lectern, there were questions ringing in his ears from the journalists there because he wasn't explicit on many things at all. There was no explicit call for the protesters to go home at all, no call for national unity. But as you were intimating there, it is likely to suck the energy out of those demonstrations. That coupled with the police actions, pepper spraying people and tear gassing them on some of the main streets that they were occupying. Also the fact that there were punitive measures threatened by the courts, huge fines. That is likely to mean that a lot of the truckers will go home. We now know that over 200 of the roads that were blocked have actually been unblocked. And for many people, well, at least half the population, the Lula supporters, all this shows that despite concerns about whether or not Brazil was going to get through this, it's shown that Brazil's institutions are robust. But at the same time, as you were saying and we heard in that clip there, the protesters were told by Mr. Bolsonaro that they had a right to feel a sense of injustice about how this election had been carried out without any evidence that there was fraud. But it will leave a very bad taste in their mouth and it will take a long time to create some kind of unity here.
After his short statement, Mr. Bolsonaro's chief of staff said that the process of transition of power would begin. What should we expect from that in the coming weeks and months?
Well, in truth, it has been going on behind the scenes anyway. The only person who was not involved in that transition was Jair Bolsonaro, at the very head of things. There has been apparently some meetings in ministries between the outgoing teams and the incoming ones of Lula da Silva. We're hearing that they've been opening the books, looking at the finances to make sure that there are no particularly nasty surprises. And I think there will be a few eyebrows raised because a lot of money has been spent in the last few months by Jair Bolsonaro's government, and the economic situation is really looking pretty dire for an incoming Lula government. So he's going to have his hands tied in so many ways. We do know that Lula is planning to go to the COP27 meeting in Egypt next month, and that's going to be part of his handover period and part of his sell to the rest of the world, if you like. That's a key policy looking at zero deforestation within the next year, which is a really daunting task for him to achieve.
That was Nick Miles. Now, from one election to another, because exit polls from Israel suggest the former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, could be about to make his political comeback. Mr. Netanyahu was ousted last year after 12 years in power, but polls now give his right-wing bloc a slim majority. Official results are expected in the coming hours. I've been speaking to our correspondent, Tom Bateman, who's at the election headquarters of Mr. Netanyahu's Likud party in Jerusalem.
Well, they're giving Mr. Netanyahu a pretty thin majority, but it is a majority according to those exit polls. So he would get 61 or 62 seats in Israel's 120-seat parliament, and therefore enough to form a coalition of his religious right-wing bloc. Of course, we have to caveat all of this because these are just exit polls. They're projections based on a sample of voters as they come out of the polling stations. But if that carries through into the morning, well, then we will see Mr. Netanyahu return to power after over a year in opposition. And crucially, he will do so with the support of a far-right ultra-nationalist party that, according to those exit polls, has got anything up to 15 seats, making it the third largest party in Israeli politics and almost certain to give it seats at the cabinet table.
Like you say, potentially the thinnest of majorities in Parliament. But there's been a high turnout to this election. Will that to some degree buoy Mr. Netanyahu and his party and give them some degree of mandate to govern with?
Yeah, we saw the turnout surge throughout the day, despite the fact that because this is the fifth election in just 4 years, people had thought that there would be voter fatigue potentially and that we wouldn't see a high turnout figure. Now that is in fact the reverse that seems to have been the case. I think that's partly to do with the fact that we've seen such a polarised campaign. Voters, first of all, still deeply divided over Mr. Netanyahu himself, but also the emphasis that the incumbent coalition had put on the fact that the far right were showing such strength. They said this was a dangerous moment for Israel, that these people, in their words, would set the country on fire. So I think that motivated a lot of people to get out and vote either for or against those blocs. You know, as for his ability to govern, well, if he can build that coalition with just 61 or 62 seats, it's still going to be very fragile. And that is the dynamic that we've seen throughout this last 4 years of Israeli politics, where there just hasn't been the ability for either of the parliamentary blocs to form a stable enough and a strong enough, in terms of number of seats, coalition to keep governing.
The BBC's Tom Bateman. Over the past week, Russia has ordered civilians to leave a pocket of land it controls along the Dnipro River, where Ukrainian forces have been advancing to try to capture the city of Kherson. Russia says the move is necessary because of what it describes as a possible missile attack on a dam which could lead to catastrophic flooding. Those so-called evacuation orders are now being extended to cover up to 70,000 people, prompting Kiev to accuse Russia of forcibly evicting residents. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner told us more.
Well, it's fairly clear that Russia has been indulging in something that they call maskirovka. They gave the impression that they were pulling out altogether Kherson, which of course is the only city in Ukraine they've managed to take. It's strategically important. It's right down at the bottom of the Dnipro River, where it flows into the Black Sea. They are coming under a lot of military pressure from Ukraine, so they gave the impression they were pulling out. In fact, they're not. They are reinforcing the city. They're pulling civilians out of there, and it appears moving quite a lot of them into Russia. The Ukrainian military have been slowly taking villages to the north of Kherson, but they are slowing down in their advance because if they're going to try and retake that city, it's going to be really tough house-to-house fighting. The Russians have got one big advantage. It's not their city. If it gets pummeled into the ground, that isn't their problem. For the Ukrainians, this is their land. They're not going to want to fight so hard that it reduces the city to a smoking ruin of rubble.
And we mustn't forget the time of year. It's early November, winter is setting in, which is going to make the execution of objectives for both sides even harder.
It is, and what the Ukrainians have been quite successful at doing is hitting the Russian bridges across the river Dnieper. So the Dnieper River flows like a central spine right down the middle of Ukraine from north to south. It flows past Kyiv in the north, from the marshes up further north of that, around Chernobyl, all the way down past the big cities of Dnipro and Zaporizhia, down into the Black Sea. And the last city on that river is Kherson, and it's on the west bank of it. It's going to be quite hard, I think, in the long term for Russia to maintain its forces on that west bank. And what Ukraine has done is to deliberately knock out the bridges that could evacuate Russian armor, but leaving enough bridges that if they want to get their people out, they can. One of the reasons why I can't give you a clearer picture of it is that there is a news blackout from the Ukrainians. They don't want the Russians knowing exactly what's going on down there. They don't want the Russians to know what their strengths and weaknesses are.
The voice of the BBC's Frank Gardner. It's emerged that police in South Korea received calls warning of potentially deadly overcrowding before a crush that killed 156 people in Seoul on Saturday. Transcripts of the 11 calls reveal that people at the scene had urged officers to intervene to avoid a disaster in the Itaewon area. The head of the country's police force has admitted its response to the incident was inadequate. Our Seoul correspondent, Jean McKenzie, reports.
The desperate calls for help started coming hours before the deadly alleyway crush. People could see the disaster approaching. The first call to police came almost 4 hours earlier. This reconstruction shows how, with chilling clarity, the caller predicts what's to come.
People are coming into the alley, but they can't get out. I barely escaped. It seems like people are going to be crushed to death.
The police were given more opportunities to act. They received another 10 of these warnings. But by the end of the night, more than 150 people would be dead. Giving a solemn bow, the head of Seoul's police agency admitted it had failed. Its response to those calls had been inadequate, he said. But the question still is why more police weren't sent ahead of time to manage the crowd, which was expected to be huge. Documents from a local authority meeting show no evidence crowd control was even discussed. The government is promising systemic change as evidence of mistakes is mounting.
Reporting from Seoul, that was Jean McKenzie. A documentary called Danny's Twins will be shown on Thursday at the Virginia Film Festival in the US. It tells the story of Danny, a quadriplegic woman who had twins, 2 baby girls, with her partner Rudy. Danny, who became paralysed following an injury when she was 23, wanted to make a film to highlight the barriers disabled people can face when becoming parents. She spoke to Rudy Clabby.
I was trying to tell the story of my journey to motherhood as a woman with a pretty profound disability. I have a spinal cord injury, so I'm a wheelchair user, and my diagnosis is quadriplegia.
Anybody who's ever been pregnant and giving birth knows what a toll it takes on your body. How did the decision then to have a child happen in the first place? Was it a difficult one?
Yeah, let me tell you the truth. It was a little bit difficult for me because I had some insecurities about becoming a mother concerning my level of independence. And every once in a while, I would think to myself, well, am I going to be able to take care of them? And I was able to overcome those insecurities by realizing that I do take care of myself very well, that I take care of my husband, that we're both thriving, that I have a full-time job. Once I got over that, I said, I think I'm going to do just fine.
Just talk to us then about disability justice and how your story, your journey, and even this film is addressing that kind of discrimination. And do you encounter it in many areas of your life?
I rarely saw authentic representation in the media concerning parents with disabilities, and I rarely saw some of the issues that we come up against in the media as well. So I've been lucky in that I haven't really encountered discrimination directly myself. A little bit, actually, in some of the comments online from people who have watched my YouTube videos. I've gotten comments saying that I'm selfish, that I shouldn't have children since I can't take care of myself, that the burden's going to fall on my husband's shoulders, and all kinds of unfounded opinions that people have. But honestly, those are just comments that have no basis, so they don't really affect me. What does affect me is policy and laws that are shaped by outdated attitudes and assumptions. For example, we have several states here where the courts can discriminate against parents on the basis of disability alone in custody cases. 35 states. I'm not in a situation where I'm concerned about custody, but it's a concern, and it's a concern to women in the community. So this is my mission for now. I really want to give hope and inspiration to other women and even men in my same situation to know that they can take on challenges and succeed and dispel the myths in society that exist in regards to, what our futures hold.
Danny Izzy speaking to Riddy Clappy. Still to come on the Global News podcast, the asteroid discovered hiding in the glare of the sun.
It would be planet-wide destruction with one that's 1.5 kilometres across.
But there is some good news. Stay tuned to find out. The new owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, has said he will impose a monthly charge for users who want a blue tick by their name to say their account is verified. He said there would also be a secondary tag indicating a public figure, which already exists for politicians. Gary O'Donoghue reports from Washington.
Elon Musk, the self-styled chief twit, says offering the famous blue tick to anyone who wants to pay for it will cost $8 per month in the United States and will upend what he calls the current lords and peasants system. The charge will vary from country to country according to purchasing power, a term so far undefined. Mr. Musk has also signalled he wants to relax Twitter's rules, leading to speculation that banned individuals, such as former President Trump, could be allowed back. But the signals have been mixed. He's also said he does not want Twitter to become a free-for-all hellscape.
Gary O'Donoghue. Astronomers have discovered a giant asteroid hiding in the glare of the sun. Worryingly, it seems that it could come close to us. But it's not all doom and gloom just yet. Dr. Jennifer Millard, extragalactic astronomer and co-presenter of the Awesome Astronomy podcast, spoke to Justin Webb.
We've managed to detect it now, but only very recently. It is a worrying one in the sense of it is a biggie, so it's 1.5 kilometres across, but it's very important to say that we are not in any danger because although its orbit does cross Earth's orbit, it's not going to do that for centuries, so we are quite safe.
We are quite safe, but our children's children, you're saying, might not. And it's a serious point. If it hit Earth, it would be, what, the end of us?
It would be planet-wide destruction with one that's 1.5 kilometres across. And that is because it would throw a lot of dust up into our atmosphere, and then this would block out sunlight, and then that's going to impact plant life, and then, of course, this impacts the food chain and so on. However, in centuries, technology is going to advance so much.
Well, that was going to be my question. It's fascinating. So, number one, would we be able to map, do you think, with some degree of certainty that it might be coming towards us? And number two, could we do something about it?
We are going to monitor this in the future, gather more data, and then more data means we can more accurately predict its orbit. But at the minute, it's on the other side of the sun when it crosses Earth's orbit, which means it is very far away from us indeed. And then in terms of being able to do something about it, we actually very recently did our first full-scale planetary defence test, known as the DART mission, where we successfully nudged a non-dangerous asteroid off its current orbital path. And so because we've had a little practice, it does mean now that we have a real strategy should anything kind of loom from the darkness in the future.
Dr. Jennifer Millard there. An historic 19th century controversy between Zimbabwe and Britain could be approaching a resolution. It dates back to the First Chimurenga, an uprising against British colonial rule. A leading figure in that uprising was Mbuya Nahanda, who was executed by the British. Her remains and those of others were then taken as war trophies and ended up in several British museums. A Zimbabwean delegation has visited the museums to arrange their return. Eugene Majuru is a descendant of the Zimbabwean royal family who took part in the war and was part of the delegation. Rob Young asked her to take us back to 1896, the rebellion known as the First Chimurenga.
The first Chimurenga began in Matabeleland, and it was engineered by a man called Mudavanu, who was a son of the late King Barry, who is my ancestor. He was also the medium of Mkwati. The nucleus of the Chimurenga was in Mazowe, the territory for my late grandfather, King Mbari. So the battle began on the 28th of July, 1896, when they were fighting the people of Harare. The British, with all their superior weapons, had failed to dislodge the Mbari people, who used their abilities and intelligence to fight the British. So they ended up destroying all the crops and houses, and then they called for backup and reinforcements so that they could destroy the Mbari people. Across Zimbabwe, the other battles were also being fought, but the most atrocities were in Harare and Mazowe, which was King Mbari's kingdom. So our involvement in this issue to repatriate the bodies is because most of the spiritual figures like Mbuya Nehanda were killed in King Mbari's territory of Harare. So we have to perform cleansing ceremonies, and these heads have to be brought back to the city and the land.
Okay, now you've been visiting various museums in the UK where these remains are. How have those visits gone? How have those conversations gone?
We visited several museums and conversations went on. We met with Cambridge University and they said they were willing to return the remains. A formal request has been submitted and they said it will take about 8 to 14 weeks to process the request. But what we discussed as well was the issue on why UK institutions were not publishing the list of the various artifacts they are keeping. It doesn't show their willingness to return the artifacts because they are waiting for African countries to contact them rather than them publishing what they have and then contacting the African countries to tell them this is what we have and your belongings are here. Because remember, these artifacts and human remains were looted, they were stolen. So what the UK is doing is inheriting looted property. We as Africans have got the right to bury our own people. We see the Queen Elizabeth, who recently died, she planned a funeral and even took part in the design of the vehicle that would carry her body. So we also need to have the chance to bury our ancestors.
Eugene Majuru speaking to the BBC's Rob Young. Now, for a complete change of gear, or maybe that should be change of hair. It was the accessory of choice in the 1990s, gracing such famous looks and locks as Jennifer Aniston's when she played Rachel in the hit TV show Friends. The claw hair clip was fashionable yet functional. No surprise then that it made a comeback during the COVID lockdowns. It was the perfect thing for making hair look good when a trip to the salon just wasn't possible. Its inventor was a man called Christian Petou, who just so happens to be the foster dad of BBC Africa's Anne-Marie Diaz-Borge. And this is her report on his remarkable story.
I think it's easy to use. Or if you want to go to a party, you would use colorful ones if you want to do a crazy style.
In salons, on the streets, in clubs and on catwalks, the claw hair clip was everywhere and still is. It's versatile, it's practical, it's cute. It's a design classic.
Our hair clip conquered the entire planet.
And that's my foster dad, Christian Petou, the man who invented it. I was brought up between two families in France. My birth mom was a refugee from Cabo Verde. Christian offered to help her and take me in when we had no home of our own. My mom always said it was good karma, that he would be repaid for his generosity. It turned out she was right.
Originally, I worked as a mold technician making models of different types of hair accessories. I started using a braid oven, and then step by step, I set up my first workshop, my first business. I made hair accessories of all kinds: combs, slides, hairbands, lots of things. In 1986, my wife and I founded our company. I was chatting to a friend and I saw him doing like this with his fingers.
My dad demonstrates opening and closing his interlaced fingers.
I had a light bulb moment. While he was doing this movement, I said to myself, I sell combs and clips. Why shouldn't I combine the two? So I did.
Before that, hair clips were basic in their design, but my dad wanted to make them more aesthetically pleasing.
It was a clip for any type of hair, curly, fine, thick, long, with a more feminine, more harmonious design. I made 7 sizes, including small ones for babies and for women who wanted to use several colorful ones at a time.
And that's when our lives began to change. At first, it was being able to buy the best quality products in the supermarket without looking at the price tags. Then, new clothes, shoes, everything we dreamed of. But it wasn't all about the money, as my foster mom Sylviane explains.
We sold a lot of clips, but we also made a lot of friends.
I traveled to every country in the world.
United Kingdom, Portugal.
And sold my clip in all those countries.
Morocco, Sweden.
Romania, Germany.
One of their distributors was Fanny Lapas, based in Greece.
It was brilliant. I sold a lot of these clips. It was so innovative. Women would wear them on a night out, but they were also very practical.
And thanks to the social media feeds of celebrities like models Bella Hadid and Kendall Jenner, the hair clip that my dad invented is having a revival 30 years on.
Anne-Marie Diaz-Borge. Now, on the Global News Podcast, it's time to wrap. Respecting rave, but not if you're in Italy, because just days into her tenure, the new Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, says she plans to outlaw unlicensed raves. Our Rome correspondent is Mark Lowen.
Well, those sounds take me back to my university days, I have to say. It all was sparked by an illegal rave on the weekend that was going to last for 48 hours, Gareth, and it was taking place in an abandoned warehouse that some 3,500 ravers from across Europe descended on, and they were going to do a 48-hour Halloween rave until there were massive complaints from people around there. 36 hours into the rave, police closed the whole thing down, and the government has now used this as an opportunity to say, we are not allowing this kind of behaviour anymore, and they've passed a law that would make illegal raves, gatherings of more than 50 people, punishable by up to 6 years in prison and a €10,000 fine.
Almost at the same time as that 3,500 person strong rave was a fascist march of 2,000 black-clad supporters of Italy's wartime dictator Benito Mussolini, and critics are saying that raves are being criminalised, but political extremist gatherings are not.
You're right to mention that gathering. It was over the weekend at the site of Mussolini's tomb in Pedapio in northern Italy. So what the opposition has said here, the left-wing opposition, is that this new right-wing government, led by the first far-right Prime Minister of Italy since Mussolini, has clamped down on raves that are typically attended by left-wing anarchist groups, but has at the same time allowed far-right fascist sympathisers to gather. The government says that they've got nothing to do with each other, and the Mussolini commemoration had no threat to public order and public security, but it is seen here as an indication of which way the political wind here is blowing, and opponents are calling foul.
And legend says Mark Lowen is still reliving his days from university. That was Mark Lowen in Italy. Now, in his time, Joseph Bellon is said to have been as famous as Mozart, but the first classical composer of African ancestry was effectively erased from history by Napoleon during the French Revolution. Now, his comic opera, The Anonymous Lover, is being revived for a new production here in the UK. The newsroom's Richard Hamilton reports.
Joseph Bellon, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was the illegitimate son of a French aristocrat and a slave girl from his plantation on the Caribbean colony of Guadeloupe. At the age of 7, Joseph travelled to France, where he enjoyed a privileged education. He grew up in an era when racism was still enshrined in law, but became an exceptional horseman, fencer, violinist, conductor and composer. He also led France's first all-black regiment in the French Revolution and was a prized guest in the salons of Paris. But the director of the concert, which includes his work, Simone Ibbott Brown, says it was his stance against the slave trade that provoked Napoleon Bonaparte to suppress his legacy.
Napoleon, who was a great was supported a lot by many slave traders. It wasn't a very good look for him to have such a prominent and important member of the French Revolution as a black man in that time. So much of his work was lost to us, was destroyed from history, was banned at the beginning of the 19th century.
Joseph died in Paris in 1799 in relative obscurity, as eventually did his music. 3 years after his death, Napoleon reintroduced slavery in its Caribbean colonies. In his lifetime, Joseph Boulogne composed numerous operas, symphonies, string quartets, and violin concertos. But The Anonymous Lover is his only complete surviving opera. Interest in his work was only recently revived, and The Anonymous Lover was streamed to an audience in Los Angeles during the COVID pandemic. This concert will be held at several venues across England this month, before finishing at Glyndebourne in Sussex in December.
Richard Hamilton. And that's all from us for now, but there will be a new edition of the Global News podcast a little later on, maybe or maybe not, containing raves and operas. If you want to comment on this one or the topics we've covered in it, do send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. You can also find us on Twitter @GlobalNewsPod. This edition was mixed by Chris Hansen, the producer was Emma Joseph, the editor, Karen Martin. I'm Gareth Barlow, and until next time, goodbye.